Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" So Jesus went away from Galilee. This was the last time he was in Galilee. This was his first step towards his final journey to Jerusalem, though he'd take a little time getting there. He's been to Jerusalem. He's gone there for different feasts at different times, but this is the final journey. Remember, he had already told his disciples a couple times that he must go to Jerusalem. He must be handed over and killed. And as they traveled in this general direction, I'm sure this information was floating around in their heads. We're on our way to Jerusalem. Remember what Jesus had said to us a couple times, probably a little dread. But for Jesus, this bit of travel was business as usual. Getting there was business as usual. His focus was still the people who were following him. And not only that, but on this journey, Jesus did something unique as he traveled. And it wasn't unique to the common Jew, but it was unique to Jesus. It says he entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And you just read over that, and what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. But it does mean something. So he's in the north, he's in Galilee, he's heading south, and he crossed the Jordan River into an area called Perea, which is modern-day Jordan. So he actually left Israel, and they call it Judea beyond the Jordan because it attaches to Judea, and they would claim it as being Judea, but it was a region called Perea, and this was a common path that Jews would take going back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem, and it was not the direct path. It was out of the way. And you're like, well, why would they go out of the way? Why wouldn't they take the direct path? Because the direct path took them right through the land inhabited by the Samaritans. And the Jews hated the Samaritans more than they hated Gentiles. The Samaritans were half Jews. And, maybe for that reason, they hated them all the more. But they wouldn't even walk through their land. And so they would go around, they would take this route. And I say it's unique for Jesus. I don't know which routes he took other times he went. But we do know the story from John 4. And in that story, Jesus was traveling north from the south to Galilee. And that time he didn't cross over the Jordan and pass through Perea. Instead, he broke the rules of common prejudice and he walked straight through Samaria. The disciples may have been uncomfortable with that, and even interacted with a disgraced woman who ended up sharing her Jesus story with the people of her town. And it says in verse 39, that's John 4:39, many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So Jesus had no problem walking through the land of the people that the Jews commonly despised, and it was the most direct route. But this time he's taking the common, prejudiced Jews route. And in this we see that Jesus is not restricting his ministry from those Jews who carry this unjust prejudice. He was going to minister to them also. In our world, the Jews who avoided Samaritans would get canceled. What do you mean you won't walk through Samaria? You're canceled. We're shutting down your social media. Our culture would shut them down, take away their voice, shame them. But to Jesus, they were also people who needed to hear truth and be given the opportunity to respond to it. And as we'll see, they were also people who needed to be healed. So we see that there are large crowds following him, and maybe this is why he went that way. If he had continued through Samaria, those crowds probably would have dropped off at the state line. He definitely would have lost those Pharisees that are about to give him a hard time. But he chose to go this route. There were people in that crowd who were in need of healing. And this is what Jesus did. He stopped in Perea on this out-of-the-way path to Jerusalem, and he healed them. And I think the transition between verse 2 and verse 3 is interesting. It says a lot about the awareness of the Pharisees. Jesus was performing an incredible ministry of compassion. Sometimes we get so used to what Jesus is doing, and we just hear he's healing people, he's performing miracles, and we're like, we just get so used to that. But if we stop and think about that, there's a whole crowd of people there. They're sick and lame, and Jesus is healing them. Miracles are happening. There's great excitement. And people were being healed, and the Pharisees weren't aware of the amazing work that Jesus was doing. They had an agenda. They were only concerned with an opportunity to entrap Jesus with a contentious point of doctrine. And before we get into that, I'd like to start talking about, before we start talking about divorce and all that, we're not going to go way into it because we did back in Matthew chapter 5. But I'd like to recognize something that they were not aware what Jesus was doing. And I think that's significant. He was doing incredible things. He was changing people's lives miraculously, and they didn't see it. They were only thinking about their own agenda. And we see them doing this multiple times. But here's what I get from this. I think we need an awareness of what Jesus is doing. Because sometimes we can get kind of caught up in our own agendas and totally miss it. If we don't have an awareness of what Jesus is doing in a certain time or in a certain place, we might be prone to interrupt it with our preferences or our agendas. In our modern world, we might recognize what Jesus is doing by the gifts that certain people are operating in. Jesus is going to be doing something unique through a person who is a gifted evangelist. Jesus is going to be doing something unique through a person who operates prophetically. Jesus is going to be doing something unique through a person with an apostolic ministry. And since I'm very literal to the meaning of the word, for me this refers to those who are sent, to like our missionaries and our church planters and anyone going out to represent a sender and to start a new work. I mean, even the disciples didn't become apostles until they were sent out by Jesus. Jesus is going to be doing something unique through a person who is gifted administratively. Jesus is going to be doing something unique through a person who is called to be a pastor teacher. And of course, there are variations of this as God gives people uniquely. And so if a church leader, let's say there's a certain church somewhere, and God has put this person in a position of leadership, and that leader is a strong evangelist, and people are getting saved and baptized regularly, then in that church, Jesus is doing a unique work. And if you're part of that church, you need to be engaged in that kind of work, and you need to be on that team. You need to recognize this is what Jesus is doing in this place. This is an evangelism-heavy place, because that's what God has gifted the leader to do, and he knows what he's doing. That church leader might not be a great Bible teacher, but they're a great evangelist, and God knows what he's doing by putting him there. Our church is strong on teaching the Bible. That's our focus, because I'm the pastor here, and that's my gift. And I'm not an evangelist. I could share a Greg Laurie message word for word and invite people forward, and there'd be crickets. It's just not a gift that God has really used me in. But God knows what he's doing. So if you ask, what is Jesus doing at Calvary Chapel? The answer is he's teaching people the word. He's equipping them for the work of the ministry. And if you're part of this church, then you need to be engaged in this kind of work. You need to be on this team. And people might say, Pastor Chad, we want to see more people getting saved in our church. And man, I agree. It's nothing more than what I would love to see that. But evangelism isn't a gift that has worked well in my efforts. I can only hope that God's going to raise up evangelists in our midst. If I'm doing my job to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, then I pray that someone is being equipped to operate in that gift. So don't come asking me to do it. I'll just turn around and ask you to do it. If there's revival happening somewhere and you're there, you need to recognize this is the work that Jesus is doing in this place. If there is a refreshing renewal, a doctrinal correction happening somewhere, people are stripping away the wrong ideas they had, they're embracing the truth, that is the work that Jesus is doing in that place. But what happens is sometimes we don't recognize what Jesus is doing in a certain place, and then, we have our preferences and we have our agendas, and we just want to interject them. Sometimes a Christian will become so passionate about something that they become completely unaware of what Jesus might be doing at a certain time or place. An example of this might be a hyperfixation on a certain doctrinal view. Young men who become Calvinists often struggle with this. Charismatics struggle with this. People obsessed only with prophecy. All they want to talk about is prophecy. The examples are endless. Vodi Bakum, who is a Calvinist, calls these young men who are passionate about Calvinism, he calls them caged Calvinists. Vodi, why are you calling them caged Calvinists? He says, because they need to stay in a cage for a while. They're just too passionate. And it's okay to get fixated and passionate about certain things along the way. It's kind of part of the learning and growing process. But sometimes we become so hyper-focused and isolated in our own world of knowledge and interest that we become completely unaware of what Jesus might be doing. And that's what was going on with these Pharisees. They were only interested in their agenda. Hey, we're here to entrap Jesus with our tricky question. Yeah, but look at people are being healed. Miracles are happening. Incredible things are happening. That's not what we're here for. We're only here to trick him, to entrap him. So let's interrupt this incredible, miraculous work and satisfy our own interests. And what did they want to do? Of course, trap Jesus in his own words and discredit him. They've tried this many times. You know, they're kind of like Bullwinkle pulling a rabbit out of his hat. That trick never works. This time for sure. Wrong hat. You Bullwinkle fans know what I'm talking about. Anyone know about that? Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my... Okay, good. One. That trick never worked. But we'll give it another try. We'll do it again. They wanted the crowds who were following him to go back home and return to their synagogues and assume their roles under the authority of the scribes and the Pharisees. So here's what happened. Matthew 19, verse 3, on down to verse 6. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife." I like the King James word there. Cleave to his wife. "And the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And so the coming together of two into one is a work of God. God does that. What makes a man and a woman who are married in covenant with God, what makes them one? God does that. He does the work of joining them together. And so Jesus doesn't even answer their question. He just presents to them the ideal. You guys are worried about divorce, but here's God's intention for marriage. And this is how it's supposed to be. If a married couple in faith is committed to the covenant, this is what they will do. And these Pharisees, they wanted lawful exceptions. Yeah, but there's got to be an exception. And Jesus reminded them of what the law called them to do. They have become one flesh. God did the work. This was a God work that brought them together. And no man, husband and wife included, should separate what God has joined. And that's what God intends. But that's not what they wanted to hear. They had extensive writings in their commentaries on divorce, and the Jewish leaders practiced divorce rampantly over the most petty reasons. Like in terms of marriage integrity, it was not a common thing amongst many of the Jewish leaders in this day because they had laws that basically let them out of their marriage for little to no valid reason. They had exceptions written into their commentaries. So they pushed the topic even further. Verse 7 on down to 9, they said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. He's talking to these guys directly. When he says, because of your hardness of heart, allowed you to divorce your wives, he's talking to these Pharisees. This has been going on in the midst of this group of people. The Pharisees were most likely referencing this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then he finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. Now, in their commentaries, they're like, well, we want to find out what it means that of her not finding favor in his eyes. And so their commentators wrote extensively about this, trying to define what this meant. It's obvious by the word indecency and other passages in the Bible that Moses is speaking of adultery, because that was a patriarchal society. It was just the men. We're not that society anymore. Men and women are equal on this. But the word indecency definitely spoke of adultery, but the Jews wanted to define it differently. If the man did not like his wife's cooking, in fact, one prominent Jewish teacher in his writings, basically, he gave the example is that if she burns your eggs, if she burns your breakfast, then Moses commands you to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away. If a man found another woman he preferred and lost favor for his wife, he could divorce her. Why? Well, following the command of Moses. Moses commanded him to do it. And these were the rules that the Jewish men in Jesus' day were operating by. They were interpreting the Bible to fit in with and justify their own carnal preferences. And we look at our world and we say, wow, not much has changed. It's crazy how people twist the word in order to find some kind of justification for their own sin. We want to live like worldly people. We want to do what worldly people do. We want to be accepted by the unbelieving world. We want to be accepted by our society. We want to affirm everything the world affirms. And so we're going to twist the scriptures so we can have the world and yet feel justified by what the Bible says. Their wording was emphatic. They said that Moses commanded this. And if it's a command, then they were bound to follow it. So one day this guy comes home and doesn't like his breakfast, and his wife's put on a little weight, and she's got some wrinkles, and he's just like, you know what? I'm just not favoring her anymore. And I need to follow the command of Moses. And this was happening amongst the Jews, especially amongst the Jewish leaders. So if they lose favor for their wife, it was obedience to the command of Moses to divorce that wife. And in many cases, it was just simply a matter of these men wanting another woman in their life. So Jesus corrects them. It wasn't a command, it was a permission. And why did Moses permit it? He said, and he's speaking to these guys directly, because of your hardness of heart. He's speaking directly to the Pharisees. And it was for the hardness of heart of the people back then too. But he's saying, Moses wrote this for you because you have a hard heart. They're being told that they possess the same hard heart as the children of Israel did in the wilderness. And then he spoke directly to their own actions on the matter. They were divorcing their wives for petty reasons. They were marrying others. So that's what Jesus confronts them with. Let me speak to something you guys are doing. Let me speak to your marital situations right now. Unless she was sexually immoral, that is adultery, your divorce and remarriage is adultery. Basically, Jesus is telling some of these guys, if not all of these guys, that they were adulterers. And of course, the question always comes up in our world where many people are divorced and remarried, and whether are they in a perpetual state of sin, which is a concept incredibly contrary to the doctrine of forgiveness. And I'm not going to rehash all that stuff. I went into it in Matthew chapter 5, but I'll share one passage that I didn't cover in Matthew 5. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, Paul talks about the people who will not inherit the kingdom of God. And it's a long list, but two in that list are the sexually immoral and the adulterers. And the list goes on, but for the sake of this topic, we'll just mention those two. And then he concludes the list with this statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11. He says, and such were some of you. So he's speaking to these Christians in Corinth. Some of you were adulterers. Some of you were sexually immoral. But here you are, after that, in church, believing in Jesus. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the power of our God. So what you are now is one who is washed and sanctified and justified in the name of Jesus. What you once were doesn't matter. Is remarriage God's best plan for your life if indeed the divorce wasn't a matter of adultery or possibly the abandonment of an unbelieving spouse? The answer is no. Remarriage is not God's best plan for you if your divorce doesn't fit these biblically defined situations. But then a lot of people, well, we did it anyway, and here we are. And in the 1 Corinthians 6:11 category, and even if it wasn't God's will, you're still washed and sanctified and justified. And you can always pray that new marriage will end up being a long, fruitful, and redeeming experience. So let's continue. Matthew 19, verse 10. So the disciples heard this. The disciples heard Jesus say, you can only divorce your wife for sexual immorality. You can't divorce her for any fickle reason. And the disciples are hearing this and like, Jesus is making marriage sound pretty hard. It's like, I'm not sure if I want to get into this. And Peter, who's married, he's like, I didn't sign up for that. And so here's what they do in Matthew 10. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. And of course, Jesus, in true fashion, doesn't necessarily answer the question that is being asked. He didn't answer the Pharisees directly, and I was not answering these guys directly. But he gives them a little story, a little illustration. It's kind of a parable based on the last line of this. We get the indication that this is kind of a parable. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. And that is kind of an indication, too, that this is a parable. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. So this response from the disciples reveals that they too have been indoctrinated with this way of thinking about marriage. They grew up in Jewish tradition. They grew up under the teachings of the synagogue. And I don't think they liked the answer that Jesus gave to the Pharisees. They too must have looked at marriage in the same disposable manner as the Pharisees did. It's like what Jesus said about marriage made the idea of marriage, wow, this sounds like a pretty hard commitment. You mean if I marry my wife, that's it? What if one day I come home and she burns my eggs? What if she puts on some weight and gets some wrinkles? Sorry. But we've been taught it's a command of Moses that we can get out of that. No. If I can't divorce my wife for burning my eggs, then is it even worth getting married? If I can't divorce my wife when a more attractive single lady comes along, then am I sure I want to go into this kind of commitment? Some of these guys are married, at least Peter was, and we could assume some of them were still single. And it seems like they're asking, if marriage is going to be this difficult, is it just better not to marry at all? And a lot of people read this and they kind of go to that thinking that Paul laid out in 1 Corinthians 7, that, being single, their intention was to say, won't we be more free to do ministry if we remain single? And that's what Jesus' answer is. But that's not the intent of their question is. We know the intent of Jesus' answer has to do with the freedom of singleness to do ministry, something that Paul repeats in 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 9, where he says to the unmarried, it's good to remain single, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. Jesus' answer seems to be on track with what Paul is thinking. But this doesn't seem to be what the nature of their question is. If they were asking about singleness being beneficial for ministry, you would think the previous context would lead to that motive, but it doesn't. The Jews extolled their obedience to Moses in divorcing women that did not please them. Jesus told them they were committing adultery, and God does not intend for marriages to be split apart. And from this argument, the disciples basically say, well, if we can only divorce her for like real bona fide adultery, then maybe it's just easier to be single. It's kind of a knucklehead question. It was probably Peter. He said a lot of knucklehead questions. And Jesus doesn't answer it, so he speaks to the deeper issue, just as Paul told the single people in 1 Corinthians 7, if you cannot exercise self-control, you should marry, and it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Jesus basically says some people can handle singleness. Some can't. Some are called to it. Some make a choice. And he used the example of eunuchs. Some are made eunuchs by other men and are born and live as servants. That's not the disciples. He's building up to something. Some are born that way with no ability to reproduce, possibly no drive or lust or passion for sex. That's not you guys either. I'm building up to something. And then he says some have made themselves eunuchs. And what he means by this illustration is some have, for the sake of the kingdom, some have chosen to ignore their attractions and their passions, and they've committed their lives to singleness to serve God. And if you choose singleness, don't do it because marriage is such a hard commitment. Do it for the sake of serving God. And we know this is an illustration or a parable because of the way Jesus begins it and ends it. Parables often end with, if you have ears to hear, then hear. And meaning to understand this, you really need to be tuned in to understand this. And this one ends in a similar way and begins in the same way. Let the one who is able to receive it, receive it. Verse 13, then children were brought to him that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people. Get those kids out of here. As if they forgot what just happened at the beginning of Matthew chapter 18. But Jesus says, let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. And he laid his hands on them and they went away. So the disciples have already forgotten what Jesus said in the first half of Matthew chapter 18. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Remember that, guys? Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Here you are trying to drive them off. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven is like a child. If we want to be the greatest in the kingdom, we need to look to children as our example and humble ourselves. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven is like a child that Jesus protects from those who might cause them to sin or to tempt them. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven should not be despised, for Jesus rejoices over every one of them with the same kind of excitement as a shepherd who finds the one lost sheep. And now in chapter 19, people are bringing their children to Jesus, and he had just healed a bunch of people, and he was esteemed and loved by these people, and they had children, and they wanted this great man to pray for them and to bless them. And what do the disciples do? They rebuke the parents. They had forgotten the lesson, so Jesus has the opportunity to teach them again. Let them come to me. Do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to people like this.